Welcome to the Big Suey, presented by DraftKings,
Why are you listening to this show?
the podcast that seems very similar to the other Dan Le Batard podcast.
I'm sorry, I'm not going to apologize for that.
In fact, the only difference seems to be this imaging.
I have been tempted in restaurants just walking past tables to grab somebody's fries that if they're just there. That hasn't happened to you guys?
I've done it.
And now, here's the marching man to nowhere, Fat Face, and the habitual liar.
Welcome back to Meadowlarkers, episode 41, the Dirk Nowitzki episode. And it's fitting. We're going to go with a Dirk number. We're going to go with a basketball topic. I'm joined as always by Howard Bryant, coming to us from the depths of the wilderness of New England. And down in South Carolina, I believe, in parts unknown South Carolina, we've got Kate Fagan. And guys, a couple of weeks ago, there was a really curious thing that happened. It's a curious occurrence and a curious reaction. The curious occurrence, the New York Knicks signed Jalen Brunson to a huge deal this offseason. It was a big free agency get. They may or may not have tampered, depending on whether you ask Jalen Brunson's dad, who just happens to work for the Knicks, or his agent's dad, who just happens to be the president of the Knicks, right? A lot of mercurial kind of ties going on there, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. What we're going to talk about is the Knicks had their big free agency signing. They're very proud and happy of themselves, and they do the show pony thing where they're going to have a press conference and introduce him to the New York local contingent. You'll notice I very carefully didn't say the word media in there because this press conference, and I can't call it a press conference, excuse me, this conference was attended only by Knicks employees, season ticket holders, and Bill Pito, who is one of the main hosts on Madison Square Garden Network. That's the curious or odd occurrence that happened, that you would have a huge free agent signing and introduce him and not invite any of your local or national media to be there to ask questions, to just document the happenings. But the other part that was very curious, dare I say from my curiosity standpoint, a little bit more curious, was the idea that most Knicks fans either didn't care or applauded this move to have the media frozen out. They wanted the state-run propaganda angle and the pom-poms and the cheerleading of this day, and they didn't want anybody to rain on the parade with, questions. Lots and lots of questions. And so I want to start here. Before we get into what the Knicks are doing, I want to start with, I grew up in a time where we were taught that the media was the watchdog, this fail-safe, right? The one that asks the question so that the people in power don't get to just do whatever they want without any accountability. And there's been an erosion, or it feels like from my standpoint, there's been an erosion of that belief within the American public. And so you two are more journalistically inclined than I am. I'm just a schmuck who found his way. And I want to toss it to you, Kate, first. Is there an erosion in the belief for the need of a free press? Not even an erosion in the belief of the free press, but in the need for it.
I think unequivocally there has been an erosion of that. And I think that the Knicks, I'm getting caught calling it a press conference too, the Knicks announcement, the Knicks rally about their signing of Brunson struck me in my heart for a couple of reasons. One was that
it didn't make that many waves. Like, even in researching this topic, once we were like, this is what we're talking about, I was like, all right, I know Amin passed around the Sports Illustrated article by Chris Herring, and I was like, but there's got to be a dozen others of people deconstructing why this matters and the impact on this, and how, like, it should be flagged from day one that this can't happen continually, whether with New York or any other franchise. And like, that didn't even exist, or at least I didn't find it when I went to look for that type of commentary on why this is happening and why it can't continue happening. And like, so I think the erosion, if we're sticking specifically in the sports world, like it is directly tied to the ability for anyone to tell their own story now. And that's been a reoccurring theme of Meadowlarkers, is like how it's affecting the media, how it's affecting our storytelling now that athletes have their own production companies. And now that you don't need to rely on the photographer for the New York Times to take your photos, like everyone has not just one in-house videographer, photographer, but like your Phoenix Suns, right? They have like 5. So part of this is like, okay, it's this weird twisted thing that's happening, and Howard, maybe you can like shed some light on like trying to pull this apart. But it's like, all right, everyone wants to quote unquote control the narrative now. And there are more tools than ever to reveal the truths, supposedly the truth about something, because we all have access to the ability to tell it. So it seems like the more technology we have to reveal and show things, right, before we get into like video manipulation, which is a completely different beast, but like the more desperate people seem to be to control what those devices are showing.
I have a lot of thoughts on this, and I don't think that this needs to stay inside of sports, because it can't, because we're not really talking about sports in general. We're talking about where we are as a culture. And this is an extension of where we are, of who we are. There has been a movement for the past 50 years, really the last half century, to move the American economy away from the public and toward the private. There has been a movement toward, in sports over the last several years, to move away from the public and into the private. That we have sold to this country that we don't owe anybody anything, that nobody owes. There is no such thing as community. And when you hear over the last several years, especially during the Trump era, people keep talking about the survival of democracy. And it sounds like this really, really overheated term, and trying to save democracy. Democracy has been in trouble for a really long time in terms of the tenets of what we believe to be a free society. And part of that free society is a fourth estate, which is us, which is journalism, in having a responsibility to the public. Our jobs are to Amin's point about being a watchdog, our job is to be the voice of the public. And if there's no public, then the industries that we're supposed to be covering feel no responsibility to us, because they are being allowed to privatize. And I find it fascinating historically. If you go back to coverage of sports in, say, the 1800s, you go back and read newspapers from the 1800s. Back, there were no photos, no pictures. It was just columns and columns and columns of stuff. Go read a baseball story back then. It was merely a recitation of what happened, of the score. And then,
out of necessity.
Yes, but then in the 20s, you started to see a little bit more communication with the players. And then in the 20s and the 30s, then you started to see the teams themselves were paying for the writers. They were paying the travel for the reporters, that they paid for the meals. They paid for all of it because it was good exposure. It was free exposure. It was free advertising. And then in the 1940s, late 30s, early 40s, a couple of reporters, I think Dick Young of the Daily News was one of the first ones, who decided to go downstairs and talk to the players. It'd never been done before. And this became the standard of what our job was. Now you go downstairs and you ask a player about the game. And then for the next 60 years, 70 years, that's what our business has been. And you've seen a slow erosion against that, to the point where I remember when I was on the beat in the late 90s, the early 2000s, I said, we're going to be reaching a point where we cover sports like they do soccer or the movies, where all you do is cover performance only, and you don't have any direct access the way you used to have access to the players and to the organizations. And what you're seeing right now is, to me, really, truly disturbing, because it is, even though we're just talking about basketball, we're just talking about sports and the Knicks or whatever, the existence of the fourth estate, our reason for being, is to relay information to the public. If the public has decided it chooses not to receive information from what is ostensibly us supposedly to be the independent source, it's a very dangerous place to be. And it says a lot about the erosions across the board. So on the one hand, I remember reading Chris's story. On the one hand, I thought that it was a real slap in the face to Knicks fans. But on the other, it's an act of aggression. On the other hand, it's just a power move to be like, look, this is how we're going to do business. And this is how we're going to do business from now on if we choose to.
I think one of the curious things, and I've used that word curious a lot because it genuinely, it's something that I flip around in my brain and I think about, is like, how could this be? Is the idea that right now we are describing this, and I guarantee you there's a segment of our listenership that's saying, media people complaining because you guys didn't get invited to the party. And it boggles my mind that these people don't understand. No. This is hurting you, you big dummy. You want to know as much as you can about your favorite team, about your favorite sport, about your favorite players. This isn't about us. We are merely the conduit through which you can find out information. And to the point that Kate made about narratives, that's a thing that people like to bring up. Oh, the media has always got an agenda and they've got narratives. And no one stops to think, you don't think if you let them tell the story, they've got an agenda? And theirs is a lot clearer than ours, if ours exists at all. Theirs is very clear. Yeah, they're going to put forth the cleanest face they can. And that's the part that I just don't understand, guys. How is it that as we're telling people, yo, this hurts you, they're saying, no, it's not. This is all about us, about you guys, pointing at us.
The number one thing here to me is the idea of media itself is so broad, it's so sweeping right now that it covers a lot of things that aren't journalism. There's a major difference between media and journalism. Pundits are media, but they're not journalists necessarily. You see this all the time, the talking heads who are entertainers, who are doing debate shows. That's not journalism, but it is media. So I think it's really important to sort of make that distinction. And we don't make that distinction nearly clearly enough. And we don't fight for our side of the business nearly enough. I think what the Knicks are doing, or at least to me, I think Kate's point, which I think is really interesting, is that the fact that people aren't really talking about this and that everyone sort of lets this go suggests a level of surrender that is disturbing to me.
To tie this first chunk up, like this idea of media versus journalism and storytelling that's coming from the team versus coming from journalism. To your point, Howard, it may seem to an outside perspective that like 6 in one, half dozen in the other, right? Like you might not even know what you're missing until it's gone when it comes to the distinction between storytelling via journalism and narrative distribution via media.
And reporting.
Exactly. And like, I think, you mean, to your point, what I was thinking when you were talking about people who are watching, say, the NBA, and they're getting all of their content about their team and the storytelling about their team through the team's social handles. To me, if you break that down, there are problems on that on so many levels. And one of the first ones that comes to mind for me is the storytelling that's coming out of a specific team or the voice of that team is specific to normally whoever the dominant personality is, often the coach, maybe a star player. And that's what the social media handles follow, right? Like the people who work in-house, and Amin, you might know that, right? Like, it's like, oh, okay, so-and-so's the coach. They don't like it when we talk about these things. Here's the tone that we take to distribute information about our team. That storytelling is then attached to a transient member of that organization whose longevity is, we don't know how long, 2 to 3 years. And they're telling a snapshot of a story about a franchise. They're not telling a long, like wide lens story about like a city and a team. And again, we've had conversations about whether like cities and teams really have storytelling now the way they used to. But the larger point here is that true journalism and an actual journalist covering a team, does not have a narrative that they are trying to distribute. They are often trying to put this team in a larger historical context as well. And like all of that is missing when you're talking about like media distribution. And that's like a key problem, I think, just one of the many problems that we can get into here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the difference between, the reporting piece of this is we are moving, it's very consistent with who we are as a culture right now. People don't want to be asked questions. Remember when Barack Obama was elected in 2008, one of the first things he said was, and we're going to have a transparent White House. And then he didn't really have a lot of press conferences and didn't answer any questions. Powerful people don't want to answer questions. Like, we look at things right now, and how many times do we see some really innocuous shit, and then people lose their mind, like, that wasn't even a tough question. People are so used to, when you're in a position of power right now, like the leagues are, and the leagues have reached a point, relationship-wise, with local media, because the newspapers are really not doing great in any markets, and that they don't need the coverage from us anymore, and the players don't need the coverage. There was a time when there was a necessity that you needed us to reach the public. Now you don't need us to reach the public. But as we've seen, whether we're talking about politics, whether we've seen about the environment, whether we've seen it about sexual assault, let's go think for all the things that people are upset about. And when you're talking about the Carolis and everything else and what happened to all those girls at USA Gymnastics, that story was broken by the Indianapolis Star. That story, that wasn't USA Gymnastics saying, hey, we've got a problem. That was independent media doing what its job is, which is to be responsible to the public.
And that's kind of to the point that I was trying to articulate earlier, is like, it may seem right now to like an average consumer of news that there's really little distinction between what would have come out of the Brunson press conference in New York if there had been members of the press, journalists, invited to cover that, versus what came out of that when it was closed off and it was in-house media members and season ticket holders. Like, you might be like, okay, you know what? If I'd read a story by the New York Times, how much different is it going to look? But like, visually, it's like that small fork in the road where like we fast forward 10 years and the differences are incredibly stark. And I was thinking a lot about how, one thing that became very clear in being inside a Division I athletic department for 5 years was that we kind of had all of the signs of a cult. I mean, we have our own banners, we have our own colors, we have our own songs, we have our own everything. Like, if you look up what is a cult, we are checking all of these things. And what we don't want is a future where, when there are no checks and balances, which journalism provides, you get down the road on this if we really think that what the Knicks did might be modeled elsewhere in the league. Like, pretty soon, whatever is put out, and I don't mean that far in the future, you're going to look at the team as like, oh, that's propaganda. That is. Well,
it's already happening, propaganda. Kate. It's already happening. I mean, when you go back to the mid '90s, okay, and all of a sudden you started to see MLB.com and NBA.com and NHL.com and NCAA.com and NHL.com. You've got these house media organs. And I remember, because I was covering the A's for the San Jose Mercury News, I remember that when MLB.com first came out, a lot of the guys who were starting to work for MLB.com, they wanted credentials into the BBWAA. They wanted to be, and I was like, no. And for years, we fought that. And part of the reason we fought it was, you are not journalism. You are an in-house organ, so you don't get a chance to vote for the Cy Young and the Hall of Fame and the rest of the things that we do. You are not part of this. We've since relented, and part of the reason we've relented is because our industry has collapsed to the point where that is now a viable place to work. And it's in all of this changes the journalism in a lot of ways. How eager are you going to be to investigate a place that may one day hire you? How eager are you going to be? And what that does is that empowers places like the New York Knicks to just cut you out entirely.
So let's talk about the Knicks for a second specifically, because I talked to a couple of Knicks beat writers, guys that cover the team on a regular basis, and they said this is the latest in a years on years weaning basically any sort of chance of having a positive relationship with the media for the organization, to the point where players and their representatives are begging journalists to write features about some of the things that they're doing in the community and things like that. And the journalists are replying back, I wish I could, but every time I request to the team, I get shut down. And it's causing a friction here. The Knicks policy now is, unless it is a mandatory media event as dictated by the NBA, they're just not going to make anyone available to the media unless the NBA says you have to do it. So at this point, my question becomes, and I know you guys want to jump in on this, but I just want to get this question out first. At what point does Adam Silver have to say, this is bad for business? You can't do it like this. I know the letter of the law says you only have to do availability for this, and this. But overall, what you are conjuring here is a bad relationship with the media in one of the biggest media markets in the nation.
It's like a classic case of short term versus long term. A couple things. Let me back up too, because one thing that rings true for me when Amin, you talk about the Knicks story is like you both remember when women first started to being hired in as coaches, as assistant coaches at the NBA level, other places. And one of the first things that, like, when you would talk anonymously to male coaches, predominantly most of the coaches in like the NBA or the NFL, they would say this thing about, well, my biggest concern about having a female assistant coach is that I'd have to change the way I act in the locker room. And you're kind of like, well, if the way you act in the locker room is that big of a problem, maybe it's more of a you problem than an allowing a female assistant coach in. Now, I don't want to go down the road of like, I know there's nuance to that, and there's like, that's a deeper conversation. But my parallel is that, like, if you are an NBA team right now and your solution to, in the Knicks case, like decades of not winning, is that the press are the problem, actually seeing inside what we do and communicating with us in somewhat of a transparent way, because it's never going to be fully. If that's a problem for the Knicks, then to me, it seems pretty obvious that the problem is not really with the press. The problem is with the Knicks. And it seems odd to me that the fans, and certainly you can talk about the tabloids and that they are certainly exploitative at certain points, but like, I'm making that parallel and that, like, to me, it's like, it's so obvious that like this is the biggest problem with the Knicks than with anyone else. But back to my original point, no one seems to be saying that.
No, the problem is with the owner. That's what's happening here. The problem, the relationship there is similar to the relationship in Washington with Daniel Snyder, is that you've got bad actors working here. When I was on the beat, I remember numerous times getting calls. It does go both ways. The team wants to have a celebrity softball game, so will you put this in your notes column? It all depended. To me, I would do it if I had a good relationship with the team at the time. If not, do it yourselves. And there were times when a player would do it. This player's got a celebrity bowling tournament, or this one's got a golf thing for cerebral palsy or whatever. And if that player and I had a good relationship, I was happy to promote the good works that they were doing. That's not my job to promote the good works that you're doing.
You're doing him a solid at that.
Exactly. And they do me a solid by treating me right and not lying to me. In the Chris Herring story, It was very, very clear that Chris Herring's a better person than I am. Because in his story, he talked about one example where a member of the Knicks PR lied to him outright and had him have bad information. And the bad information came directly from the team. And when he confronted that person, he said, hey, my job is to protect this organization. And I'm thinking, Chris still let that guy be anonymous. I'm outing you by name if you do that to me. And you should get fired for doing that, because that's unprofessional. That is unethical. And the fact that he still did that guy the solid by keeping the story anonymous, I was like, yeah, man, we would have had to throw down. And so I sort of felt like what's really happening here too is there's a level of leverage that the league, that the team has, that they feel like they have. And they're just making a power play. This is all just a gigantic power play now that the players have done it in their own way. This is no different than what LeBron James already does. If LeBron James is not speaking on behalf of the team in an organized media session, you can't get LeBron for an interview unless it's on one of his platforms. And so this is one of the things we're all moving to. When was the last time LeBron just did an interview with the New York Times or with any newspaper?
But I guess I can see a world where the player can take control of that, because ultimately the player is not an employee of the NBA. The player is a partner, right? A contracted worker, if you will. I don't understand how Adam Silver can sit back and allow a team to very deliberately erode its relationship with every single outlet. It's a difference between, I don't like Frank Isola. Frank Isola doesn't give us a fair shake. I'm not going to give Frank Isola access, or I'm going to give him limited access, or I'm going to conveniently forget. It's another thing when you say, all of you, done. You're done. This is the direction. Only person who asks questions around here is Bill Pito.
I mean, I was interested in what you were saying, Howard, too, in the first few minutes about, if I'm trying to be as objective as possible about this conversation, and we've all articulated levels of concern about the Knicks story, but have we as sports journalists gotten used to a level of access that was too much access to begin with, right? If you're a Hollywood reporter and you don't expect to be able to speak to Scarlett Johansson twice a day throughout the filming of her movie, is there something about this that is, and I'm not saying I believe in this, I'm just wondering, Howard, your thoughts on it. And also hearkening back to what you said, and I use an old-timey word because you were talking about the 1800s, that, the column inches that used to just be descriptions of play, and is some of this a pullback of the NBA having granted too much access at various points?
Well, yes, it's all of the above. There was a time when sports, baseball, basketball, etc., were newspaper mediums. It's not a newspaper medium anymore.
Yep.
They used to rely on that type of access, and it served them. The argument must be now it doesn't serve them anymore. It served them to have us write about their product, especially the NBA, which was fledgling for so long, which was they needed all the publicity they could get. It was in their best interest to bend over backwards to make sure somebody was paying attention. Mm-hmm. Those days are over. So the model that was once created, where in baseball, you would come downstairs and the clubhouse was open for 3.5 hours. Right? I mean, clubhouse opened at 3:30. I mean, 3.5 hours before game time. And then the clubhouse was closed after batting practice. The clubhouse was closed for batting practice. And then it reopened after batting practice. We had enormous amounts of access. And so what's happening now is what happens when sports believes they're like the movies. Well, we have our own network now. We have our own TV. We have our own websites. We don't need them to be in our clubhouse anymore. We don't need them to be in our locker rooms anymore. In some ways, you can make an argument that that's better for journalism. In some ways, because now it gives you the freedom to really cover this industry. If you really want to cover the industry, now you can really go after them and cover them. You're not giving the Cleveland Browns the Deshaun Watson buddy pass because you need access to the locker room. Right. I mean, one of the things that they actually do get a lot of dispensation of is the relationship when it's not as adversarial. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't get covered. For sure. So to me, the way I always viewed it was I'm covering an industry. I'm not covering my favorite team or your favorite team or the fun and games. I'm covering an industry. I'm covering the business of sports. Part of the business of sports are the players and the games and the coaches and the injuries and the ethics. It's an industry. It's no different than covering the school board or covering anything else.
Yeah.
And those industries existed the way they've existed because they felt they had a responsibility to the public. And the way to reach the public was to go through us. They didn't always want to do it, to your point, Kate. They didn't want to do it. Now maybe they feel like they don't have to. Now, the interesting thing to your point, I mean, about what they're going to do is whether or not Adam Silver says, hey, here's an opportunity. And then all of a sudden the Boston Celtics do it. And now the Denver Nuggets are doing it and the Phoenix Suns are doing it. And this becomes the model. And then we end up, and you know that there's a relationship with European soccer where I'm sure, especially as there's more and more and more interglobal connections, where they're probably going, you know, Arsenal's like, we don't offer that. Why do you guys do it that way?
Just talk to them as you walk back to the locker room, and they're
exactly.
all
Why
clamoring
do
against
you
the
guys?
rope.
You guys give how much? Or like when anyone who's covered the Olympics, mixed zone. You go to the mixed zone, and that's it. That's the access you get.
Stugotz here for my friends over at Simply Safe. Home security isn't a game. No, it's not, but a lot of companies act like it is, trying to upsell and overcharge you every chance they get. This is why I use and trust Simply Safe Home Security. They are different. Simply Safe is advanced technology that puts the safety of me and my family first. Easy to set up. If I can do it, anyone can. There are no long-term contracts, no hidden fees, and the peace of mind that I get with Simply Safe Home Security is second to none. Simply Safe monitoring agents truly care about your well-being and are highly trained to help you keep calm and safe during stressful situations, staying on the line with you until help arrives. How about that? For caring and peace of mind. Customize the perfect system for your home in just a few minutes at simplysafe.com/DLB. Go today and claim a free indoor security camera plus 20% off with interactive monitoring. That's simplysafe.com/DLB. There's no safe like Simply Safe.
Quickly to your point, Howard, about it's this idea of like the journalists being a check and balance for the organization, for the industry. And even as you said, that there are even checks and balances within that job. It's not as if when I was the beat writer, it wasn't like everything I saw and everything I could have reported, I reported, because because that would not make any sense from a human perspective of being able to say what you actually thought, report every single piece of it, and then walk back in that room day after day. Like you are usually walking, I don't know if this was your experience too, Howard, like you're walking some form of a tightrope between sharing as much of the truth as you can, but also be able to continue to share as much of the truth as you can going into the future.
Well, that's right. And still having a relationship with them. Not everything needs to be public. You are also in on a private club. I remember one time, one of my all-time favorite stories when I was on the beat, 2003. 2003, the Boston Red Sox were not playing very well. And not only were they not playing well, but they were losing in a very specific way. Their relievers just kept giving up games. And so we're sitting there pre-game, we're up in Toronto, and Grady Little, the manager, is in a scrum with us. And he says, you know, we need our starting pitcher to go. You know, we need our starting pitcher to go, you know, deep into the game tonight because can't be having those suicide bombers coming out of the bullpen. And this was right when the Gulf War started, the ground war started. It was 2003, I think it was April, right? So the country's at war. And we're like, all right, I'm like, suicide bombers. I'm like, that one, my ears went up, but okay. We walked out and that was it. We go upstairs and here comes Kevin Shea, the PR guy for the Red Sox, going, hey, brings over the guys in a huddle and says, could you do me a solid and just scratch that suicide bomber quote from Grady? That didn't come out the way and everybody was like, yeah, okay, no big deal.
Yeah, right.
Why was it okay?
Because there was no upside to you publishing it, right?
Have an agenda to bury Grady Little. It would have embarrassed him. It wasn't what he meant. We knew exactly what he was trying to say. And it was one of those moments where he would have looked terrible for no reason at all. And it was not germane to what we were trying to do.
And maybe part of the issue is that Now that could never happen because there would have been 15 cell phones in it and it would have already been tweeted out. So like there is an issue with like,
well, and that's where the players, exactly. They have to remember the players are convinced that we are in that room to surreptitiously tape everything they say. They believe that we are in there to destroy them.
It's a big gotcha game. That's what we're
exactly.
That's what
they really,
to be fair to them, there are people in that room who are there to.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why they feel that.
And it's like, and it's not true, your point, Amin, because like the larger economic model about like clicks is driving people to actually be in that room for the simple fact of once out of every 20 times they'll catch something that is a headline worthy.
And that they get the gotcha and deep down. And that's one of the reasons why accountability, when you do this job, they'd always said if you've written something tough about a player, show up at their locker the very next day. Stand right at their locker so you can take whatever don't hide. Don't hide. If you got something to say tough about a player, then make sure you're at their locker the next day.
So let me ask you guys a question before we transition to a different part of this topic, a different side of this. We're all grizzled veterans here. I want everyone to give me a story where the organization that they were covering attempted to flex in such a manner. Like Howard, you gave a great example of the Red Sox doing it the right way because you had a good relationship. They said, do me a solid, and you did them a solid. Give me an example of the opposite of these assholes.
One other example of something like that, because I'm trying to think of a flex, was on the Sixers beat, the first game back for Allen Iverson when he signed that 1-year contract to come back to the Sixers. So this would have been like 2010, 2011.
Right.
The very first home game at what was then the Wachovia Center was sold out for the first time, certainly in my time on the beat and in a very long time. And of course, the players are supposed to be there a minimum of 90 minutes before the game. 90 minutes passes, no Allen Iverson. And he didn't show up to the game until something like maybe 55 minutes before game time. And we were all in the locker room. And, the PR guy was like, just, can you all do us a favor and not report that right now? It's like we're in this moment of we've brought him back. We've got momentum. Right. He's so beloved. And, nobody wrote that he was late to the game. Again, that could never happen in 2022 because somebody would have been tweeting it the second it happened.
Still not here.
Yeah. Oh, video of him walking in, and it is 6:05.
But that might actually even be the rights holders doing it and not us. Somebody is paying attention to all of this.
Exactly. Like the TNT broadcasters might even be catching that at this point. But to your point, I will now think of a flex.
Howard, I felt like you had one.
Yeah, you had a flex.
Oh, yeah, absolutely there's one. Sandy Alderson used to be famous when he was the president GM of the A's. He used to be famous for what the reporters used to refer to as managing the news. And what he used to do, say, Kate's got a scoop that Jose Canseco's about to be traded. And so Kate is going to call the organization to check her source. I hear that Jose is going to be traded. We do it, she's going to be ethical. She's doing it the right way. Just want you to let you know, I've got a story saying this. Do you have a comment, et cetera, which is what you're supposed to do. That's journalism, how we're taught. Sandy, not wanting to be scooped by a newspaper, would then take your phone call and then tell everybody and then release a press release.
Brutal.
Which is 100% steaming bullshit. Oh my God, you can't do that. He would do it all the time. And the late Frank Blackman used to be like, Sandy's managing the news again. And it didn't make a difference how big or small the story. That if he felt like, okay, I don't need this breaking on me, and this is way before social media, then the A's will be the ones to release the news. And you're sitting there just steaming because you've got a scoop. You actually have an exclusive. You actually did your job. You got a piece of information ahead of everybody else.
And that phone call is always your last phone call.
And that's the last call you make before you hit send, before you call the office and go with it. And then all of a sudden, here comes something over the fax machine for everybody.
That's an interesting strategy. Now the front office guy, I mean, is like, that's brilliant. Just tell the truth before anyone else has an opportunity to have an expose, and like we're done.
That's right. So now, exactly, it's like, well, think about the relationship between, the reporter and the organization. Now, my personal one was not really a flex; it was more of a relationship thing. When Billy Beane was building his reputation to the Moneyball legend that he would become, one of the ways he did that was Peter Gammons' notes column. And he would talk to Peter, and, his name would grow because Peter had so much enormous influence. Right. And so there was this one time right before the A's traded Kenny Rogers to the Mets for Terrence Long. It turns out there was a game in Colorado against the Rockies at the Coliseum. And I guess whatever went down between them, Kenny didn't pitch or barely pitch and then got traded very quickly. And everybody was talking about the A's tanking the season. Oh my goodness, how can you get rid of Terrence? I mean, how can you get rid of Kenny Rogers? He's your best pitcher. And how could you let this, happen? For a guy who's not even in the big leagues, obviously you guys are tanking the season. We're in Kansas City now when that deal goes down. I get a call in the press box. Phone call, Howard Bryant, back in the day before everyone had cell phones. Howard Bryant called, phone call. I go into the side. It's Billy Beane calling me because he's enraged that everybody is saying that the A's have tanked the season. So he tells me this wonderful story about what went down over the weekend and how Kenny Rogers refused to pitch and how I told Kenny that if you didn't get your ass on the mound, I'm not trading you and you can sit here for the rest of the season. And that's just off the record, you and me talking. And I'm like, okay. A couple days later, the whole exchange ends up in Gammons' column. So he gave me the story off the record and then let Gammons write it because it went national. So I called him enraged. I'm like, I'm not your shrink. What are you doing? You can't do this to me. You cannot tell me this whole story and then I can't write it and you're going to give it to a national guy? You make me look like a schmuck. What the f***, right? I mean, I was insane. So then a few weeks later, my phone rings and it's Billy and he says, we're trading for Omar Oliveras. Are we square now? And he hung up the phone.
I mean, so I don't have a story, but now that I'm listening to Howard, I was on the Sixers beat. I felt like I was so young, right? I was 26 years old when I started it, that I was never really able to construct relationships to the degree that Howard's talking about right here. Maybe it was youth, maybe it was just my personality. I just could never I never felt like I could get to a place where I understood in some way I was a peer. And so I always felt so like obsequious, like I'm the one who needs things, right? I need access, right. I need time, I need information. And like, I never could quite understand that I was also offering something. Whereas now, 15 years later, I understand the dynamics more. That is probably not as germane to the conversation we're having, but those are my thoughts as like Howard's talking,
It could, I'll give you an example. Obviously, I've never been a beat writer, but when I was doing The Jump, gave a lot of opinions, and I know of at least one team where the owner was so upset about something factual I said about the team that he ordered, allegedly, my credential to be pulled, at which point someone on the PR staff said, if you do that, you're going to make it 1,000,000 times worse.
Yes.
Because
that's
now
a better
he goes
story.
On air. Now he goes on there like, they wouldn't even let me in the building. And that's absolutely what I would have done. I would have laid a flamethrower down on whatever was left of the crumbling
all
room.
of
I don't want to name the team, but
all of these things, and Kate, all of them come back to the same thing, which is a feeling on the reporting side and also on the organization side that they have a responsibility to the public. That's what this whole thing is all about. It's all about whether or not you're conveying a message. How does that message get conveyed? And the shifting, what's happening now is that message is not a public partnership anymore. Now it's the organization, the private organization is going to determine what they want you to know, which is something they've always done. But they also knew that there had to be a public component to it because that's how we've been for the last 75 years. And we're not like that anymore.
I disagree. I think
you disagree with what?
I disagree in that I don't think there's a public component from the team side. I think they've always done it because they realize if we don't do it, much like in my situation, if you do this, if you take this road, it's going to make things so much worse for us. They don't care about the public, but they care about them having good standing with the public. I think what's changed is that somehow, through whatever forces, whether it's what's happening in the political landscape starting from 2016 or even before that, whether it's what's happening with player empowerment and everyone having their own in-house production company pretty much, whatever the reason, they've trained the public to say, I don't really need my vitamins. I don't need my Brussels sprouts. I don't need my asparagus.
No, that's 100% correct.
But both and that. But if the public demanded it, they wouldn't be able to get away with it.
But both things are true. You're 100% right. Nobody demands to get their vegetables until they're malnourished. And then what ends up happening is when you get exposé, you get up and you have scandal. You have stories like the sexual harassment stuff happening. You have these women coming forward to the Washington Post about what's going on. Now all of a sudden you need a free press. Now suddenly they need a watchdog.
Yeah.
You need a watchdog when somebody is leaking the Deflategate story. And you need that independent or outside voice to hold the institution accountable. Obviously, you don't want that on a daily basis because you're too interested in having your fun in games. Let's not forget that the fan is as selfish a component to the game as the players in the organization. They have a a vested interest in this thing looking the way they want it to look.
Yeah. And the word we've used a bunch in this hour too has been not just public, but power, right? Like Howard, you've said it like that. The scales have tipped where the league and the players had so much more power than they did in the 80s and 90s. And it may seem, right? It may seem so satisfying in the short run to not have to deal with the headache of journalism and the press. But it's also an indictment on, in this case, the Knicks in general, like, and the NBA as a whole, if this continues down that lane, that when you get the power, the decisions that you make are going to influence where you go with that power. Somebody very smart in the NBA has to be saying, okay, this relationship is bad for us. It may be good for us in the next 5 to 6 years that all of our social media can capture what it wants and has a unified voice about who we are. But in the long run, that is a destructive decision.
Well, people deep down, no matter how much you play it, people don't trust the information coming from the same source. Eventually, that collapses. That breaks down. That does break down to propaganda. That does break down to mistrust because you know it's coming from an untrustworthy source, the individual. And that's the reason why when we talk about it last year, when we were talking about these documentaries where the subject is the executive producer, they're really interesting for access, for the sake of access. But when they're not revealing, it's like the difference between Man in the Arena and Last Dance and the Tina Turner doc, than some of the other ones that aren't so good, where they still have to be revealing. You have to learn something. You have to get some information out of this. And if you're in a position now, like we're in, where you're going to have this glut of propaganda, people are going to turn off to it. They're not going to watch it because they're not being challenged. Like, one of the things that I found interesting about the Derek Jeter doc was when that doc was first starting, I got an email from Jeter's people asking me if I wanted to participate. And in the letter, it said, "You are one of the people Derek has approved to be in the documentary." And I'm like, I don't want to be the person that Derek approves. I want to be mysterious and dangerous, and I want to be. I don't want to be somebody's bobo.
Not list.
Exactly. I want to be on the other list. I'm not a monkey. Come on.
It's the Marx Brothers, right? It's the I don't want to be a member of
exactly. I don't want to be a member of a
right?
club that would have me as a member. I don't want to join a club that would have me as a member. And I was like, well, wait a minute. Is this saying that Derek thinks I'm harmless? That I've never written anything? Exactly. I'm the safe guy? I know what I've been insulted. I'm violated right now.
That's a good way to end it, y'all.
Yeah, let's wrap it there. There's so many more questions. Like, what were the questions they were avoiding, by the way? But that'll be like a whole hour.
I want to see the list where he said no. That's the list. I want those guys to do a documentary.
For Howard Bryant, for Kate Fagan, I'm Amin Hassan saying thank you very much, and we'll see you next time right here on Meadowlarkers.